So, you know, the sort of religious conservatives too have been under pressure. So you have all these, you know, people have always kept their own pain, their own suffering, their own grievances, but somehow there hasn't yet been the ability to sort of connect the dots, as it were. You know, to see that there's a system that was a very oppressive system. And so you have, you know, the Kurds may focus on their own problems, but they may be against the Islamists. The Islamists, you know, are complaining, or were until, you know, they came to power, complaining about the oppression they were suffering, while not seeing that others were also experiencing problems. And suddenly you have all these things, it's like the lid has been lifted. I mean, partly with the arrest of these generals, and clearly the judicial process is very flawed. As I said, the net has been cast too wide and a lot of people were arrested. But on the other hand, the fact that this, the all-powerful military that had always kept the lid closed on all these things is no longer all-powerful and can no longer block these things, means that suddenly you have all these stories coming out and people don't know how to deal with them. This is part of the process. You know, right now, for instance, there's a huge debate just in the past 10 days that started about the events of Dersim, which were a very painful episode of that had to do with the Kurds, but also the Alevi minority, and basically where the state crushed this particular pocket of Alevi Kurds in Dersim. There were, I mean, the official figures, I think, talk of 14,000 dead. Women, children, I mean, they were just massacred. Well, yeah, I mean, the figures are, they're different figures, but the official figures they quote these days is 14,000. But there's probably a lot more. No, you're right. I mean, there's definitely more, but these are the figures that are being discussed at the moment. But the problem is that these are issues that took place in 1937 and 1938, and suddenly you have a discussion about Ataturk. You know, I mean, Ataturk has not been discussed. It's a crime to criticize Ataturk still. And suddenly you have this incredible debate, which started, in fact, within the opposition party, which was Ataturk's party. And suddenly you have one deputy from that particular region that started talking about it, and then the party was all, you know, they started fighting with each other. And then you have the prime minister who sort of, you could say that he used the issue to hit the opposition, but on the other hand, he did something that had never been done. He apologized in the name of the state for the atrocities committed in Dersim. Now, if you know Turkey, you probably realize that this is something major. But of course, these things are complicated. You know, the other day I was having lunch with a friend, and he was, who is a liberal, but also, you know, liberal secular, let's say, and Kemalist to a certain extent, but not a radical Kemalist. And he was expressing his concern. He was saying, but you know, if you remove Ataturk, I mean, if you puncture that myth, and decide that, yes, it's Ataturk who actually ordered, or at least, you know, it was under his watch that these massacres were committed. If you puncture that myth, I mean, what holds us together? what makes us Turk? What makes this nation? So you have that sort of debate that is taking place. And obviously these days, the Kurdish issue has come back to the fore in a rather unfortunate way, because violence has erupted again. There was an attempt in 2009, the government tried to launch what is called the Kurdish opening. And I think that it was a genuine attempt at first to try and reach a solution. But it quickly went wrong. I mean, the first step was to try and bring back some PKK fighters and Kurds who were in northern Iraq in this camp under the control of the PKK, and the idea was to bring them back into Turkey as a sort of confidence-building measure. They would come back and then go back to their normal lives, and then that would be the first step of some kind of peace plan. And then it all went wrong, because when they arrived in Turkey, unfortunately, the PKK fighters were still wearing their uniform, and they were welcomed by huge crowds. The Kurdish party sent buses with crowds, and everybody was celebrating the great victory of the return of the fighters. So, of course, as you know, Turks are very nationalist. Nationalism is always just below the surface, and these images, shown on evening news, did not go down very well, and everything sort of unraveled. And it is at this stage that the members of this umbrella organization started being arrested. And things have, could not go any further. On the other hand, while the sort of public steps that were supposed to have been taken could not be taken because of these setbacks, at the same time there were a lot of things happening behind the scenes, and in fact, to illustrate how things have changed in spite of the problems, it was only a couple of months ago, it was revealed in the press suddenly that in fact the intelligence services had been negotiating with Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, who's been in jail since 1999. And, 10 years ago, at the time he was arrested, you could barely mention you would never see the word Öcalan or the name Öcalan in the press without having some, a baby killer, monster, chief terrorist or whatever. You always had this. And suddenly you could have in the newspapers that, the state had been holding negotiations with him in order to find some kind of peace settlement. And, there were a few comments in the press here and there, but basically nothing happened. Now the negotiations broke down, and unfortunately then both sides sort of returned to, the PKK stepped up its attacks, and of course once you have against violence, once you have funerals of soldiers and so on, then you get again into a cycle of violence, and then you have the retaliation, the armed, the bombing raids on the PKK bases in northern Iraq and so on, and then you get into this spiral of violence again, and this is where we are now. So right now it doesn't look very promising, but on the other hand, as I said, you have all these other things that are happening that are not just about the Kurdish issue, but that are about Turkey sort of confronting its past, Turkey confronting all kinds of other things. It's difficult to, the government may have thought that when they could claim or apologize for their sin, they could contain it. But obviously, once you start talking about the events of their sin, you have to start confronting other things, you know, and inevitably, starting from their sin, you will have to make the link with what is happening now and what has happened in the past 30 years. And that too is something that is beginning to come out. You know, you have had arrests of people who, members of intelligence services or various shady, you know, state-supported organizations that carried out assassinations of Kurdish activists and Kurdish intellectuals in the 1990s. So you have all these things coming out, and obviously it's taking a while to, I think it's going to take a while to sort of, until the dust settles and people come to terms with things. But there's clearly a different kind of awakening too in Turkish society. Right now, there's obviously the Kurdish issue is the key problem, and unfortunately, I think that the government right now seems to have decided that negotiating with the PKK, negotiating with Öcalan is not useful at this point, and they are trying to sort of cut the support for the PKK, partly through these arrests, which I think is hugely risky because, of course, it can also provoke a lot more tension. And obviously, the young people in the southeast, there's a whole generation of very young people